Thank you everyone for making to the Teams Day online today. My name is Chirag Patel. Welcome to my session today on supporting third-party access and sharing in Microsoft Teams. So the agenda for today is basically we're going to be talking about briefly just how to go about approaching to a third-party access to Microsoft Teams, as well as the wider services that are attached to Microsoft Teams, and really kind of just to think about some of the things that you should think about in terms of processes and policies and other elements. And then we will be looking through the administrative controls, not just Microsoft Teams, but also other areas, and in particular, how they can be used to align with your policies that you may have in order to control the guest access to your tenant. And then we will look at some of the effects of those sharing, whether it's a guest access to the Microsoft Teams, or whether that's particular folder or files within a SharePoint, which is basically backed by Microsoft Teams, but also, briefly something that was announced at Microsoft Ignite, the project Octal public review. So we'll have a brief look at that in terms of what's the impact on the guest access when using a Teams database, as I would like to call it, which is basically Project Octal. So this session is really a demo based. I've got a few slides there and they will be made available after this session, but a lot of the best part of the presentation is going to be done through all the demos, so that you can actually see exactly what controls and settings there are and what to think about as well. So a bit about me just before we get into it. As I said, I'm Chirag Patel. I'm from London, UK. There's my details. You can connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn. I use the same handle, TechChirag, and there's my blog site, techchirag.com. I'm an MVP in Office and Apps Services. Been working with Microsoft 365, or formerly Office 365, for last 5-6 years, all the way back to SQL Server DBA and SharePoint administrator. So I've been around for quite some time. But generally, the kind of work that I do involves either deploying services or workloads within Microsoft 365, or do migrations, or basically build platform-based applications to complement the services around the Microsoft 365. Like to keep up to date with my certifications and qualifications, and that's the only best way I find that to learn from ever-changing technology within the Microsoft 365 space. If I have any spare time, or like today, for example, then I volunteer to speak at various community events, and these are some of the events I've spoken in the past years, with all the links to slides and videos where events are recording sessions, like the one from today as well. So feel free to check through those. And there might be something in there for you to take away learnings from that as well. So, if you haven't checked some of these events, please do check them out. And I tend to speak about pretty much anything and everything around Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and various other teams and everything else. So, do check that out as well. Okay, so in terms of when it comes to enabling or even disabling third-party guest access, then there are quite a few things to think about. First of all, it's obviously down to what is why you need to enable it, and obviously the benefits are there in terms of the external collaboration or inviting guests for a particular project. Or even a set of files, endless number of needs there are, especially in today's day and age. So it kind of goes without saying that we need to be prepared for the external sharing, as well as the manageability of that. So we need to really kind of identify the roles and responsibilities, and not really just from an IT perspective, but also from a user level, in terms of if they're going to be owner for a particular team, then they have some responsibilities on that as well, as to who they can invite or take them out of the team completely. So you have the roles and responsibility which needs to be lined out straight away. Then you got things like around compliance requirements. So we know the capability is here in order to classify your teams, whether it's highly confidential or just available for anybody in the organization. So there is the impact around how would you share that if there was a confidential document inside that team, and yet if the external sharing is enabled, then how can you prevent from that happening? So you've got that compliance requirements, but also being able to train the end users around what's the downside if you externally share for something that might not be managed properly. So training should be looked at, albeit in a very light way, from an awareness perspective. But also then you're looking into the policies as well. So from an obvious standpoint, information security policies, whether you have DLP policies enabled or whether you have policies that only a subset of users in your organization can share externally, the list is endless around that in terms of how you go about controlling that access. So whether you allow everybody to access, whether you allow everybody to share everything, or whether it's a specific owner of a SharePoint site, for example. So whatever your policy needs are, then those ought to be documented and then have the controls aligned to it. And we'll take a look at these controls in terms of where they are and how we can control that. But that would be the most common way of at least making sure that your organization is prepared for external sharing. And then you've got things around like the instructions for third-party setup. So what you don't want to do is to be able to advise every guest who's going to access your tenant how to access it, because they use probably different accounts. Sometimes they get issues where they can't come into your tenant easily. And so there is a link available from Microsoft to kind of walk them through screenshots by screenshots as to what that experience is for a guest user to access their suppliers or their partners' information on the tenant. And then you've got the ability to be able to manage those guests or doing the review as to how should they be around for this long period of time, should they be off after 3 months, all those kind of granular controls, but also looking at some of the impacts around sharing a file through the SharePoint links versus the entire group's experience. And so, we'll go through some of these terminologies in terms of the dependencies, how it relates together on that. So this is something that basically really, if you take all this together, is to think about how you're going to pave your way for a successful external sharing and being able to have that control on your information and data. So when you look at Microsoft Teams, it is pretty much the, 80–90% of our time. We switch on our machines, and that's pretty much Teams is there for us, and that's where all the work is happening, whether that's accessing your apps or your files or your conversations, whatever it is, it's all happening in Teams. But it's important to realize that behind Microsoft Teams, you've got a number of these workloads that are backed up with it. So for example, when you're having your ad hoc chats and any files you share between that chat, then those files reside in OneDrive. But if you go to your Microsoft Teams chat space, there are channels, and the files inside those channels, then they reside in a SharePoint document library. And then obviously you've got your Exchange and Online. So if you have your group mail conversations, which is pretty much different to your Microsoft Teams because those chats are persistent. But if you do want that group mail functionality where you're able to email each other through that group mailbox, then obviously that clearly resides in your Exchange Outlook. And then of course, at the moment, you've got all your meeting recordings that resides in Microsoft Stream. But as you may be aware or may not be, it was announced in Microsoft Ignite last week that later this year, you're going to get all those recordings now going to come over to OneDrive or SharePoint. So that's obviously in the next few months where that's going to happen. So you've got all these dependencies around Microsoft Teams. So when we think about sharing information to our guest, you've got to keep this in mind, that it's not just the teams that they'll get access to, but they'll get access to all some of these areas as well. And that might be okay, because if you want to enable collaboration and you want to work in a transparent way as possible, then you've got to give access to that information. But if you look at from on the other end, where you may have a huge Microsoft Team chat space, and you may have specific documents in a specific document library stored in there, and you may not want to give them access to that part of the information. So for that, you would need to step into SharePoint and control your sharing through that, so that you make sure that the guests don't get access to all the files that's part of that Microsoft Teams space. And we'll look at that in the demo in a minute as well. But that's kind of just, for me, this is a key slide to understand. And there are a lot of organizations out there who've really kind of raced away with Microsoft Teams, and rightly so, because of the current conditions we're in. But there are a lot of organizations who don't realize that behind Microsoft Teams, you have these workloads that should be thought of. So hopefully this kind of makes sense in terms of how Microsoft Teams is architected and how it sort of resides with their other workloads. So when we look at that guest access experience, whether that's your IT personnel who's actually inviting the guests from, inviting the guests, in a kind of a proactive way, or whether you're as a team owner for your Microsoft Teams, and whether you're inviting by simply adding a guest to your teams and they get access to it. But in terms of the process, when you look at this here, is that essentially you've got two areas: either IT admins can invite or the guests can't. And we'll look at those controls in a minute as well. But essentially what happens is that obviously as soon as you got the guest access enabled in Microsoft Teams, so pretty much all your teams can invite guests. And obviously the guest will redeem that by simply clicking on that link that they receive in the email and then being able to access your team. But you may have additional external sharing settings for SharePoint where they possibly may not get access to that, and just the Teams part as well. So you've got that process, and there's a link over there that gives you a nice little nice breakdown of how that experience kind of looks like. But again, we were looking just a slide ago that you got all these related elements for Microsoft 365 groups, which is the base underlying foundation for it, as well as SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business that has got access in terms of controlling that guest access. Okay, so when we look at Microsoft Teams, and we'll probably just jump in the demo at this stage. So if I look at the guest access, so there are a number of controls here you can see that you can give control as to what the guest can or can't do. So if I just jump there. There you go. So if I go in here, so I come to my Microsoft Teams Admin Center. I've got obviously all those raft of settings there, but in particular under org-wide settings, guest access, then here I have my page, which basically a single switch that controls all my Microsoft Teams chat spaces in this Teams, and by default this is usually off. So obviously in my example, Contoso Electronics here, I've enabled that. So by doing that, then I've got these other settings that I can control, whether private calls can be made for guest users or meeting controls, but also more importantly from the messaging point of view, do I want them to delete any messages they may have sent or even edit them as well. So you got those areas that you can control, and some of this can be tied back to your policies in terms of what your guest can do in your in your teams. So you kind of got to go through each of these settings, because this setting applies to all your guests in all your teams, depending on you if you switch this on or off. So you got your chats, Giphies, and all those things in there. And it's really just the one page from Microsoft Teams perspective to control your guest access checklist items within here. So if I go back to yeah, so if I go into so once this is in Teams, and I'll probably just go into my sample team, for example. If I go into my Teams chat space, so I've got a number of teams here. I've got Chirag project site there, which is I'm going to use a bit later. But if I go into my sales marketing, and I can just manage my team through that. And with one of the settings I get there is by adding the guests in there. So if I go in here in this team, I've got 14 members, but I can go and add another member here. So I can go and say, so I use my Chirag at m365uk.org. So I'll go ahead and do that, add the guest, and that's pretty much as simple as it gets in terms of adding the guest to it. So once you've done that, obviously, then when I go into my myself in the tenants, if I switch over to Microsoft 365. So here I am, I'm logged on as Chirag at m365uk.org, and that's pretty much where I am. So I've got access to my two teams. I'm connected to my Contoso guest. This is my main tenant, which is one of the user group I run. So in here, through as a Contoso guest, I've got access to two teams, and the sales and marketing is just now that I gave my access to it. And then within that, I can then obviously access my files or chats within that. And that's good, and that's great. In its simplest format, I can get to it. But if I go into my monthly reports, for example, that's one of the channels there, and I've got a set of files in there. Then once I go in there, I can go into SharePoint within that. So obviously, if I want to do more work within that, then I can just go ahead and open that in SharePoint. And once I open that in SharePoint, then I can do a lot more. I got access to other areas of SharePoint, pages, lists, and all those things, and even just share, access all those sales files as a guest. But you can see that once I'm in there, then as a SharePoint site member, which is exactly the guest member that I have, then I can see entire sitemap within here as well. So I've got other areas like folder content type view. So I've got some test files in there. But this kind of shows you that it's not just a team area, but also the SharePoint area itself that you get access to it. So full functionality as a guest within that. Obviously, if I kind of go in through here, then in terms of I can go to other areas. So if I go back to my home page, then I go my web parts and all this page designs and everything else that goes within that. So all those, that's very well. But if I then go back to my Microsoft 365 admin, then that's where the other areas is, because Teams is not the starting point for enabling guest access. So if I jump back to my admin screen, so if I go back to my screen here, now the main switch, if you like it, to enable across a tenant is through Microsoft Azure here. So if I go into my Azure Active Directory through user settings, then in here, as well as this application settings that I have, I've also got external users here as well. So if I go in through that, then essentially this is the main area. If I don't control this, then Teams will get locked out completely. So you can see the settings here, for example, that admins and users can invite guests, members can invite as well as guests can invite. Now, in your case, for some organizations, they may not want guests to invite other guests, if you like, in which case, then you will switch this to no. So that setting resides in your Microsoft Azure Active Directory. And then I've got other settings in here in terms of, do I want to just allow anyone on the planet to come to my tenant upon guest invitation, or do I want to limit by specific domains? So I can control that here for the entire Microsoft 365 tenant. Something else that's rolling into preview is guest user access restrictions. So at the moment, for example, if you want to invite anybody, if a guest is already there, if they want to invite somebody else, they can potentially search for it when they're tapping few characters to search for somebody who they want to add. So you can actually lock that down through these settings here within the guest user access restrictions so that they can't search for other directory objects like the user IDs, for example. So you have all that control within that. And so once you kind of make sure that this is all secured and kind of in place in terms of your external sharing as far as that's concerned, then the next level you want to roll down to is your Microsoft 365 groups. So if I go to the next tab here, and so this is my Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and within that I've got my org settings option. So if I go within here, then I've got two things that I'm going to look at here. Firstly, if I scroll down, then I'll be looking at Microsoft 365 groups, which is here. So here I can manage the external sharing aspect, and this is specifically, which is obviously dependent on Microsoft Teams, but this is the whole group aspects of it. So that's including your mailbox, your other elements of that as well. So here you can control as to whether group owners can add people outside or not, because sometimes if you don't want anybody in your organization to add, but just the IT admins, then you would switch that off. And also, do you want group members to access group content? So that's even your guests. And if you uncheck that, then there'll be no mails, no elements of that flowing through that. So again, this applies to all the groups that are attached to your Microsoft Teams itself. And so that's your Microsoft 365 groups, but also you've got in the security and privacy tab here is the sharing element. And this is exactly the same as what we saw in Microsoft Azure just now. So this is a bit confusing that this setting is still here, and obviously you have to appreciate where how far the Microsoft 365 has come. So before, some of these settings were in here. So this setting is exactly the same as what we saw back in the external collaboration here. So that's basically this one here, admin and users in the guest inviter role. So members can invite. That's exactly the same as what you have this one here. So that's all you need to know in terms of from controlling external sharing within Microsoft Azure Active Directory. And then you've got your Microsoft 365 Admin Center, which is your groups and your sharing aspect of it. And once you've kind of got that in line with your policies, then obviously your Teams is the area where you can do all your guest access sharing. So if I had switched some of these things off here, that would have impact on your Microsoft Teams. So just be mindful of that if you do make a change to any of these settings here. So let me go back to my slides. So we looked at the external collaboration settings, and we looked at the Microsoft 365 groups, as well as the sharing setting there as well. So the next part we want to look at here is the SharePoint related, and this is this is a big part of your collaboration, because obviously files is pretty much what we do. And so when you look at this SharePoint area side of things, then essentially it's not just SharePoint, but it's also OneDrive. And here you can control what type of guests you can actually invite, whether that's from the pool of your existing guests, or whether you want to just allow new people to come in, new customer, new partners, or anyone on the planet can come onto your tenant, and they don't even need to authenticate to that. So they can come straight. And here at the SharePoint Admin Center, you can control that that level. So let's head over there. So if I go to my SharePoint Admin Center, which I can access from my tiles here, and specifically if I go into policies and sharing, so that's the page we were looking at. Just make that slightly bigger. So if I go in here, then I can control my settings, new or existing guests, but also I can control specifically within the SharePoint whether I want to limit to a specific domain, maybe some customers or partners and nobody else. Also, through a policy, if we say that only trained individuals can share content externally, then I can check this box here to say that only allow specific people in the organization to come. So, for example, I might say only sales and marketing, for example, can come and invite guests into this tenant here. So I can control that security through this group or through other Active Directory group or whichever way. And that way I can know that only trained individuals are going to share that externally. And then you got a few other settings there. The key ones to pick here really is the file and folder links. So here you can actually basically say that only as a default, specific people can be chosen as a default way to, so you're forcing users to pick individuals, or you may just say only people in your organization. So that means anything you share, everybody in the organization can potentially gain access to that content. So that default behavior of sharing the links, you control that from SharePoint admin here. And then you got the specific, whether you want to keep edit by default or just read only. So you can control the settings, and for each of these things, you can sort of write a policy with this setting to be able to associate that functionality within that. And that's all very well and good. So, once you've kind of gone through that for your SharePoint platform level, then you can kind of go into your sites specifically. So I've got a number of SharePoint sites here. And if I pick one, for example, let's say, let's pick sales and marketing. So if I go to my sales marketing site, then here I can actually control sharing from a side of things. So if I go into my policies tab within the SharePoint site for sales and marketing, then I can actually edit that and basically override the options that I've set for a default, which is what we just looked at a few minutes ago. But here I can say that only existing guests can access the sales and marketing. And I can even specifically limit just for the sales and marketing site, which then includes the team content within that for a specific customer or partners. But also I can change that from, instead of having only people in the organization, I can change that only to say people with existing access. So, I can have that flexibility to have only one site specific controls for my sharing, including the default link permission. And all that's, that's all great because some of your teams and the SharePoint files within that will have different needs. So you may want to do this differently for each of your sites. So that's where you control your external sharing within that. And by default, this is normally enabled for external sharing in SharePoint. And some organizations put a policy around it to disable every time a new SharePoint site is created. You just simply disable that external sharing. So your needs may vary as to how you control that. So once you've kind of gone through that, then we go back into our SharePoint site. So if I go to my mark a project team here. So again, this is in terms of the team wise, this is Microsoft Teams. Within that, I've got my channels, which resides as folders within my document library. And that's all available in Teams, but here I can go to a specific library well, in this particular case, whilst the whole team gets access to it. But if I had another document library, then I could go and just share that document to anybody out there. And if I go and pick specific people, I want them to allow editing. So these controls we see here is what we were referring just now for that SharePoint site. So I can control this behavior through that SharePoint admin center for that site. But in this case, I'll leave all this as is. I'll go and apply that and just go and type in Chirag. In fact, I can type another one, and 365 Chirag at gmail.com. And then I can, and obviously it'll warn me that it's outside of the organization. It's fine, great. And I can just send that off. And that can happen anywhere in your SharePoint site, regardless of the teams, even if you've blocked access for guests for teams, and if your SharePoint site is enabled for external sharing, then you can control file level sharing through this as well. So kind of gives you a great flexibility whether you want to allow the whole team, which is probably the better way of doing it, instead of having to manage each and every file external sharing. But this is just an exceptional scenario where you may want to control that specific external sharing for a file. Right, okay, so just going to have a quick look at the questions to see if there are any before I kind of just go. So I think there are some. Okay, got one question here from Dominic. Could you please elaborate on the option to manage security groups in the sharing option? Yeah, sure. This person that shares via SharePoint library only need to be a member of the security group. Okay, so the managed security group that I actually showed you, that's more about, it's got nothing to do with document library. That applies to your SharePoint site as well. And so what that means is that if I want to have only 10 users, let's say, in my organizations who can only share externally, then I would use that security group in that SharePoint admin center to control. And then the rest of the organization will not be able to share externally. Even if they wanted to, they'll just get, you've got no access to share it basically through the organization policy. So that security group is only to control subset of users who can share externally. Hopefully that answers the question. There isn't any additional questions, so I'll just move on to my slides. Excuse me. So we looked at the behavior of the links in terms of how you can control that to the sharing dialog box. And then obviously, if you look at the actually specific site, which is what we looked at, and that this is where you can't actually have a security group at the site level. And if you do, then what you can do though is you can control is in terms of only the site owner, for example, can share externally. So in fact, just let me show you that very quickly. So if I go into my Mark 8 project team here and go to my settings and then site permissions. So here I can actually invite people, and I can invite specifically to share this SharePoint site and not give them access to the group. And the group involves, obviously, as we mentioned before, the team, the emails, and everything else. So this is purely for the content itself. But also what I can do is control how the sharing capability within this SharePoint site for Mark 8 project team can work. So the default option for all the SharePoint sites you create is that anybody, the owners and members, can share the files, folders, and more importantly, the site as well. And now that's obviously, godsend, right? But that might be okay because depending on what kind of content you have, but you may want to restrict it all the way down here where only site owners can share files and nobody else. So you have that flexibility of that 3-tier permission level as to how much flexibility you can have within that. So that's at this site level. So far what we've kind of talked about, if you like, is that you can control sharing at the tenant level, at the groups level, and when we say groups level, that obviously that's controlled for all your Microsoft 365 groups and the Microsoft Teams on top of that. But what if that just like in SharePoint, if you want to control sharing at a site level, and a specific domain, and there is no real easy way through the admin center to control that. And so the only way you can kind of do that is through running a PowerShell script. And there's the sample script here that you can take a look, is that you basically need the Azure AD module installed as a PowerShell, the preview module, simple script that basically says that, go and find me all the groups and the guest level setting in there. And basically, kind of going through the settings in there to say, allow to add guests set to false. So that's your disabling the guest. But specifically, we're looking for a specific group. So in this case, it'll be mark a project team, and we can say that, you know, disable not only the SharePoint site, and that's a separate setting altogether in SharePoint, which we had a look a few moments ago. But this one is controlling your group itself. So even though your teams option is enabled to have guest access for all your teams, but there is nothing in there to say only block one specific team to prevent guest access. And if you want to do that, then this is where you would come and run that PowerShell and block, say, that market project team, maybe sales and marketing team as well, and disable that guest access completely at the group level. So hopefully this kind of ties up that, you know, number of those endpoints, if you like, one for SharePoint, one for your group itself, which then it's you know, applies to your team and everything else, but also for a specific files level as well. So kind of you got very, you know, a variety of choices to make that may be tied up to your policies as well. So hopefully that kind of makes sense in terms of disabling the guest access for a specific team. So whilst you may have many guests on your in your teams and everything else, and that's fine, but what if that, you know, you want to monitor this now? Obviously, you know, you can use access to access reviews, which is through your Microsoft Azure. It is a P2 premium license that you need that, and is really for users who can conduct those access reviews. So this one specifically is obviously tied up with applications that you may have registered in your tenant, but also you may want to do that for a specific group itself. So you can see in the screenshot there that you can actually pick a particular member of group for sales and marketing or market project team and just choose the scope as guest users. And therefore, when you do conduct this access review, then you have a set of actions to choose whether you want to disable them or, you know, you force them to respond. And if they don't respond within the time frame, then you just take their access away. And that way you're kind of protected from your information assets perspective. So if you haven't had a chance to look at this, do recommend to have a look at that in order to control your guests that may be all over your Microsoft 365 space within that for your teams as well. The other area that you can look at is the auditing of it. So again, with the audit side of things, is that you have you know, not just from a SharePoint perspective, but also from the team's perspective, adding members to it. So again, if you have a quick look at the auditing side of things, then you can actually look at the you know, added to secure links. I've mentioned those descriptions in there, which you can then find and look for it in terms of, you know, what the access was given to. So have a look at that. But also, last but not least, I wanted to quickly show you is the Project Octal sort of thing. So, you know, this is fairly new in the space of Teams. I like to call it, and few members in the community like Laura Rogers or others, it's simply a database in Teams that you can create, which basically is like your Power Apps. And by default, guests who have full access to these records, they can create, but they can't see anybody else's records in there. So I can quickly show you that, what that looks like just before we conclude the session. So in here, if I go to in here, so where is it gone? Go to my Microsoft Teams Chirag project site, and in general channel, I've got my tab here set up to employee ideas. That's one of the templates you get from the Project Octal, and it's simply a relational data aspect, and this functionality is built for us here. So in this particular example, I've got a set of campaigns and some of the ideas around that campaigns itself, and that's all very well. But if I go into my guest experience, and if I go to my M365 UK Teams, so I'll go here. If I go to as a guest, within that, I can see all the chats, all the ideas that were added in there by myself in my other tenant. But then if I go into employee ideas, then I will not see all that other information that you saw just now. And that's just by design, that, you know, as a guest coming to Project Octal solution here that I have, I will only see my own records. Again, that might change because this is still in preview. So I've got the link in the slide. So do take a look, download it, take a look, and do that. But if I create a campaign here, then I can obviously fill out the details and everything else and do that. So that's kind of a sneak, if you like, a preview, which everybody can get to it. So you can have your forms and tables all built in as part of the application, and then be able to surface all that within your, in this case, Chirag project side team space. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up because I'm out of time on this. And so what I wanted to just say, keep an eye on the Teams meeting recordings, as I mentioned, is coming over to OneDrive and SharePoint. And obviously migrations that will be attached to that. So kind of will begin in next month, really. So keep an eye out on that, which potentially basically means that you can share your recordings to external guest users. So I just want to say a big thanks to all the sponsors for making this event happen. In particular, also Russ for organizing and bringing over 100+ speakers to this event. And I really hope that you enjoyed the session. My details are there on the blog side. You can help, you can connect to me. If you have any queries, I'll try and answer them out. I'm on Twitter at TechChirag, but also, I've got the session evaluations there as well from the organizers. So with that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the event. Quick look at the questions if there are any. I think there are a couple. If setting up security for Teams, do we need to go in sequence, start with Azure Active Directory, then Microsoft 365, then SharePoint, OneDrive? I would highly recommend you do that because if you enable Teams, then everything is on for you anyways as a default, and that's fine if that's what you want. But do work logically if you can in that order. So absolutely. Cybersecurity will only let us turn on guest access for Teams if we can turn on MFA for them, but this brings up licensing issues. Any advice? Yes, very good question. It is recommended for guests. You can turn on the MFA. In terms of the licensing side of things, I need to double check on that. I don't believe there is a licensing impact on that, but yeah, it is recommended for guests to have MFA on that. So I think that's pretty much all the questions that there is there. So thank you very much once again, and I'm around anyways. So if anybody want to ask any additional questions, then please do. But other than that, just say thanks and enjoy.